Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's lesson is entitled Free to Worship. It's taken from the 6th chapter of Ezra, verses 1 through 12. Now, in last week's lesson, we were talking about the migration of the Jews, that is Israel, back to Jerusalem to rebuild and dedicate the temple. And as I said last week, the first 6 chapters, that is chapter 1 through 6 of Ezra, is dealing with the first wave or migration of Jews back to Jerusalem. And that was under Zerubbabel. And the second wave, as I said, was under Ezra. That was some 60 years later. And the third wave is under Nehemiah. And Zerubbabel's mission was to rebuild and rededicate the temple. Ezra's role was to restore respect for the law of Moses, and Nehemiah's role was to rebuild the walls. Now, after 70 years of exile in Babylon, the Jews are allowed to return and rebuild the temple. Now that was under Cyrus. A decree was issued under King Cyrus, the Persian king, because Persia had overthrown Babylon. And so King Cyrus of Persia, and last week's lesson, issued a decree allowing the Jews to return, and a remnant, I think I said last week, about 50,000 Jews returned to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple. Now, if we look, as I said, the first 6 chapters, chapter 1 through 6. Now the work began, and we, if we take a look in Ezra, around chapter 3, around chapter 3, chapter 4, the work came to a stoppage. There was opposition. You know, there were problems. Anytime you're doing a work for the Lord, okay, there will come opposition. And that's what happened to the work at the temple in Jerusalem. You find that in chapter 4 of Ezra. And I'm going to read a couple of verses, well, one verse actually. This is Ezra chapter 4, verse 24. It says, "Then cease the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Dyrus, king of Persia." So, but now that's not the end of the story. So the work was progressing, and it ceased until, as we read here in chapter 4, verse 24 of Ezra, it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Dyrus, king of Persia. And we go to chapter 5 of Ezra, and it says verses 1 and 2. Then the prophets Haggai Haggai the prophet and Zechariah prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God, even unto them. So what happened, once there came opposition, the work stopped. So the prophet Haggai and Zechariah encouraged the people, and the work resumed. Okay, this is in verses 1 and 2 of the 5th chapter of Ezra. Now we go to verse 3 of the 5th chapter of Ezra. It says, at the same time, then came Tenai, governor on the other side of the river, and Shethar-bozer, and their companion, and said thus unto them, who has commanded you to build this house and make up the wall? In other words, the enemy came in and says, we want, who gave you authority to do this work? Okay, so once the work stopped, then the prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraged the people to resume the work. Here comes the enemy. The enemy got upset, as we read in verse 3. So the enemy was upset with the work resuming. And so what happened, even though the work did not stop, the enemy wanted authority as to who gave you the permission to do this. So if we jump down in verse 5 of Ezra, they asked for the specific names. Give me the names of the people who gave you this authority. We go down to verse 11, and this was their answer. And thus they returned us answer, saying, we the servants of God, of the God of heaven and earth, and build this house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and set up. Now, from verse 12 all the way down to 16, they give the whole story, the whole history. Okay, and we're not going to read it. So the letter was sent to Dyrus the king, and verse 17 of chapter 5. Now therefore, it seemed good to the king, let there be a search made of the king's treasure house, which is there at Babylon, whether it be so that a decree was made of Cyrus the king. That's what we talked about last week. Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning this matter. So this is where we are in today's lesson. Chapter 6, verse 1 is where our lesson takes up. So last week we talked about the decree, and as I said, we went to chapter 3 and chapter 4 where the work stopped. Then we went to chapter 4, verse 24, where the work stopped until Dyrus, king of Persia, was in his 2nd year. Okay, and then the prophet Haggai, Zechariah encouraged the people to resume the work, and the enemy, the governors, as I said, Tenai and his associates, they got upset that the work restarted, and they wanted authority. Now they send a letter to Dyrus, who is king of Persia, said, check this out. We want to know if this is in fact true. And verse chapter 6 is where our lesson takes up. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 12 is where we start. And verses 1 through 7 is our first outline, and it's entitled The Conduct of a Search. In other words, they find the decree, and this is the original decree that Cyrus issued. And verse 1 said, then Dyrus the king made a decree or an order. He gave an order, and search was made in the house of the rolls where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. This is verse 1. And verse 2, and there was found an Achmuther in the palace that is in the province of Medes, a roll, and therein was the record written. Okay, so they found the decree and the palace in Medes, okay? And the contents of that decree starting in verse 3. And the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Okay, this is the contents of the original decree of Cyrus that was found in the records of the king's palace. Okay, says verse 3, let the house be built, the place where they offered sacrifices, let the foundation thereof be strongly laid, the height thereof 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 3/4 cubits. Okay, verse 4, with 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber. Let the expenses be given out of the king's house. Verse 5. And let also the golden and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple which is at Jerusalem and brought unto Babylon. Now, we talked about that last week. We said when Nebuchadnezzar went and overthrew the temple at Jerusalem, he took the vessels. This is what it's talking about. He took the vessels down into Babylon and stored them in his treasure. And when Cyrus, king of Persia, issued the decree, he ordered those vessels to be returned to Jerusalem and put in the temple. And this is what we read. We read in the original decree, which Cyrus issued, and we talked about last week. Okay, back to verse 5. It says, it talks about which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple, which is in Jerusalem, brought into Babylon, be restored and brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem, every one of to his place, and place them in the house of God. In other words, the decree ordered the vessels to be returned to Jerusalem and placed in the temple. Now, so we see here, this is God at work. So they tried to, as we read in verse in verse 1 here, actually in chapter 5, where the governor tried to intervene. Well, they did intervene, and they stopped the work. But once the work got started, they was upset, and they wanted a authority as to who gave you the go ahead to do this work. And Dyrus, being the king, he issued an order to find the original decree, and this is what we just read in verses 3, 4, and 5. Okay, now, so that is what the decree that Cyrus had issued said. Now we go to verse 6, and this is restraining local leadership. Now, here is what Dyrus, the king, who has now succeeded Cyrus, added when we go to verse 6. Now, therefore, Tanea, governor beyond the river. So Dyrus is issuing an order to the governor. And verse 6, now therefore Tanea, governor beyond the river, Shebazna, your companion, and Apitusha, which are beyond the river, be far from this. In other words, stay away from that work. That's what he's saying. He's issuing a warning to those that are opposing the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem. He says, stay away. Take your hands off of that work. And verse 7, let the work of this house of God alone. You can't get any clearer than that. Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor, this is verse 7, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. In other words, keep your hands off of that project. This is what the King Dyrus, king of Persia, who has succeeded Cyrus, adds to this order. He's adding this. He's, in addition to that, yes, they have permission to do the work. And in addition, don't you interfere. That's what is verse 6 and 7 is saying. And we go to verse 8. This is not the end of the story. We go to verse 8, which takes up our second outline, is Dyrus Decree. Dyrus issues a decree of his own. And in verse 8, he says, moreover, this is verse 8, moreover, I make a decree what ye shall do to the elders of the Jews for the building of this house of God, that of the king's goods, even the tribute beyond the river, forthwith expenses shall be given unto these men, that they be not hindered. So, and Dyrus' role, he has an important role. His role in completing the temple, he's issuing a decree that, and let's go on to verse 9, which is Dyrus' decree continues, actually. Verse 9, and that which they need, in other words, whatever they need, that which they need, both young bullocks, rams, lambs for the burnt offering of God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, oil, according to the appointment of the priests which are at Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail. In other words, whatever is needed, give it to them without fail. This is Dyrus' decree that he issues in strengthening the project. So the answer here, the takeaway here is this rebuilding of the temple is God's will. That's God's will. And God's work cannot be stopped. Now, as we read in verse chapter 3 and 4 of Ezra, there was opposition, the work ceased, but the work resumed. But there was people that was upset that it was resumed, but Dyrus issued a decree. First, it issues a warning to those that was in opposition, don't hinder this work, okay? Then he issues a decree of his own saying that whatever they need, he said, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build the house without interference, and whatever they need, in verse 8 and 9, where Dyrus issues his decree, provided for them without fail. And also we go to verse 11. Let's read verse 10. And that they may offer sacrifices of sweet savor unto the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. So what Dyrus' decree says, whatever they need, give it to them, that they may offer sacrifices unto the God of heaven. Now, here is the downside if you interfere or do not act in accordance to this decree. Verse 11, also I make a decree, this is in addition to the decree that I have made. In addition, I also make a decree that whosoever shall alter these words, let timber be pulled down from his house and being set up, and let him be hanged thereon. In other words, it is a death sentence. And let his house be made a dunghill for this. Verse 12, and the God that has caused his name to dwell there, destroy all kings and people that shall put their hand to alter, to destroy this house of God, which is at Jerusalem. I, Dyrus, make a decree, let it be done with speed. So the moral is the rebuilding of the temple was of God. No man can stop it. It was God's will for the temple to be constructed. In other words, the act of interfering was a no-no. Even though there was opposition, the work of God cannot be stopped. And this is what we want to take away from this particular lesson. There may be opposition. Anytime, as a matter of fact, anytime you are doing God's will, there will be opposition. There will be hindrance. But God is going to make sure that no one will ultimately stop his plan. So we'd like to thank you for watching today. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.